Короче, в трубу ебало, вот пропаловку газовую, бля, хуярит, я ебу.
This is not a nuclear explosion. It is just a normal view of Moscow engulfed in flames. Over the past week, everything from ICBM facilities to military production plants, oil refineries, and air bases in Moscow and the surrounding areas has been shaken by Ukraine's serial attacks. Moscow must feel that the war will come at a great cost. Zelensky's words were a sign that the war would now be completely transferred to Russia. In a statement on Saturday, Zelensky said that Russia's latest attacks on Ukrainian cities could not be justified as retaliation. Today, many areas, including Moscow, are being targeted by 400 drones, while airports in Moscow are being closed and factories are burning. The Russian people are saying enough is enough, but the Kremlin is turning a blind eye. So what did the Moscow raids really take from the Russians? Can the fragile Russian economy withstand this? We will now examine the real mystery behind Ukraine's Moscow raids with striking details you have never heard or seen before. Moscow, Russia's capital, is a massive metropolis that was once considered untouchable and far removed from the war. But within 7 days, Russia was plunged into complete darkness. Today, Ukraine's retaliatory strike with 400 drones targeting Moscow and other parts of Russia shattered this belief. The Ukrainian attacks caused widespread panic in Moscow. In addition, 2 major airports in Moscow, Vnukovo, and Domodedovo were closed. Moscow had not yet recovered from the shock of the factory explosion in Tula that took place yesterday evening. The chemical plant in Tula was engulfed in flames. This attack was significant for Ukraine. The facility, which was turned into a fireball, produced critical raw materials that supported Russia's firepower. Explosives, particularly TNT used in artillery shells, aircraft bombs, and missiles, were produced there. On the evening of June 1st, rumors that a factory producing intercontinental ballistic missile engines had sustained severe damage left even Russian media speechless. While exaggerated messages, such as ICBM production, has ended, the rocket facility has been reduced to atoms. Circulated on social media, one thing is certain. Critical centers that feed Russia's strategic nuclear capabilities are no longer completely secure. As Russia's military logistics rely on chemicals and fuel, the collapse of these production lines could cause major problems. Other striking attacks were carried out on air bases in Milarovo, Rostov, and even Belgorod. There are claims that Mi-8 and Mi-35 helicopters were severely damaged. The loss of aircraft and helicopters not only reduces Russia's air support capabilities, but also shakes confidence in its secure rear. Normally, bases near Moscow were considered to be outside Ukraine's range, but the recent attacks have proven the opposite. All these raids have reminded the Russian people that even our own territory is now being affected by the war. The Kremlin may try to hide this fact, but no one can deny the smoke and flames. The Ukrainian government has recently stated that it will not only defend itself, but also dismantle Russia's war machine. Now, these words seem to be turning into concrete actions. Why Moscow? Because Moscow is not just a capital city. It is the economic, political, and ideological center of the Russian Federation. Every drone launched here shatters the Russian regime's untouchable arrogance. At the same time, it exposes Russia's air defense vulnerabilities in plain sight of the world. Ukraine's goal is not merely to send a message. It aims to destroy strategic targets to cripple the Russian military's logistical capabilities. When ICBM or missile factories are taken out of commission, Russia's long-term warfighting capacity is damaged. When oil refineries are hit, fuel shortages emerge on the front lines. When air bases are destroyed, Russia's air operations weaken. All of this provides indirect advantages to Ukraine's counteroffensive on the front lines. Additionally, the psychological factor is crucial. Every explosion shakes the hope of Russian civilians that the war is far from us. Therefore, the Russian government's propaganda portraying the war as a distant operation is losing its validity. Ukraine is clearly sending the message: if you bomb my cities, we will not hesitate to strike your capital. This could erode the Russian public's consent for the war. Meanwhile, the Russian army has already faced tough times in 2023-2024 due to Western technological sanctions and Ukraine's resistance. Now, the explosions in Moscow are also undermining the army's morale. The question, if even our rear bases are not safe, how can we advance at the front, is coming to the fore. Moreover, Ukraine is not only targeting material damage, but also the Russian army's strategically important equipment depots. The shutdown of sites such as ICBM factories or air bases is causing panic among the command echelons. Some generals are blaming each other, asking, how did Ukraine manage to infiltrate so deeply? Why didn't our air defense concept work? This is deepening internal debates and divisions within the army. As air bases and railway lines are hit, the flow of weapons and ammunition to the front slows down. This is causing ammunition shortages among Russian troops. As a result, troop morale is rapidly declining, and the firepower of frontline units, such as artillery, is decreasing. The Kremlin, which has already faced significant backlash during the mobilization process, may now find it even more difficult to recruit new soldiers while attacks are taking place in places like Moscow. According to military experts, Russia may respond to these attacks by intensifying its bombing of Ukrainian cities. However, this could further fuel the perception that the intensity of the war is increasing, thereby amplifying public backlash in Russia and strengthening Western support for Ukraine. Bombs exploding in Moscow are now fueling the desire of many Russian citizens to leave the country. Russian elites had already been making plans to flee to places like Europe or Dubai, and this trend has gained momentum in recent weeks. Many billionaire oligarchs, tech entrepreneurs, and bureaucratic families have already prepared homes in Europe, Gulf countries, or even Turkey or Israel. Now, Plan B could come into play. If we can find a ready passport and charter flight, let's leave Moscow immediately. Though sanctions are restricting some oligarchs' travel, those who can find a way will certainly do so. This segment could deal an even greater blow to the Russian economy by taking their capital with them. Tech sector employees and educated young people, in particular, have been exploring emigration routes since 2022. The latest attacks have confirmed the feeling among Muscovites that this is the end of the road, experts say. The borders are not closed, but bureaucratic obstacles are numerous. Despite this, thousands of young professionals are trying to move to nearby countries such as Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan, thereby expanding the Russian diaspora there. When explosions, sirens, and columns of smoke become a daily routine in many areas, from Moscow's suburbs to its luxury neighborhoods, the public psychology undergoes a radical change. For a long time, the Russian state adopted the narrative that we are not involving the people in this war. The front line is far away. But Moscow is now effectively a target. The result? Some people are furious, asking, how can we not protect our capital? This anger could lead to questions directed at the Kremlin. Where is all the military budget going? Why can't your air defense even catch a bunch of drones? On the other hand, those who have long believed that the war is exhausting are grumbling. Our own cities are being bombed. What is the point of continuing this war? The silent opposition may slowly turn into a "enough" slogan. With factories burning, businesses closing, and inflation rising, people who no longer have job security in the city may ask themselves, why should I stay in this city? Families may consider moving to other countries or Russia's interior regions, where they perceive greater safety and better economic opportunities. There are also Chechen, Tatar, Bashkir, and other minority groups in Moscow. Additionally, there are migrant workers from Central Asia. The tension of the war could trigger racism or ethnic conflicts in the city. In addition to economic hardship, some ethnic groups fed up with state oppression may resort to covert partisan activities in collaboration with Ukraine. This could be a nightmare scenario for the Kremlin. Sociologists say people who have long said, yes, we support the war, may change their minds once they feel the real cost in their own streets. But protesting in Russia is not easy. There is state repression, arrests, and harsh penalties. Still, people's silent anxiety is growing. This anxiety may not turn into mass uprisings in the short term, but what the Kremlin fears is precisely the rise of this underground wave over time. If the Russian state intensifies mobilization orders, conscription of young people could be on the agenda. However, no one wants to die on the front lines. Therefore, the number of soldiers fleeing across the border could increase. Some of these people are hiding, while others are trying to obtain documents through bribery. As a result, the migration and escape traffic within the country is accelerating. The government may attempt to introduce new laws imposing prison sentences for draft evasion. However, if economic and social deterioration continues, people will still seek clandestine routes. This is becoming a process that accelerates Russia's demographic and brain drain. Moreover, Russia has been under sanctions for a long time. The economy, which is dependent on oil and natural gas revenues, managed to stay relatively stable until the first year of the war. But over time, Western sanctions and global isolation have caused significant damage. Domestic inflation, currency fluctuations, and difficulties in technology imports have deepened. Now, as production facilities are being destroyed, the situation is worsening. When oil refineries are targeted, the domestic market may experience fuel shortages. Transportation costs will rise, logistics will be disrupted, and delays will occur in the processing of oil sold by Russia abroad. This is a serious blow to the country's main source of income. Any disruption in the production of nuclear missiles, ballistic missiles, air defense systems, and armored vehicles could leave the front lines without essential supplies. Russia is already unable to procure technology from the West. Even if it tries to source parts from China or the black market, speed and quality fall short. With factory fires now adding to the mix, the production chain could be on the brink of collapse. Chemical plants in regions like Tula are not only fertilizer production centers, but also key sites for manufacturing explosive raw materials. The destruction of these facilities could lead to a decline in fertilizer exports, increased production costs for Russian farmers, and shortages of explosive materials for the defense industry. Foreign investors, who are already cautious, will watch what is happening in Russia and think, investing in this country is suicide. Local investors, oligarchs, and the wealthy may also become deeply fearful. They may want to move their capital abroad, thinking, if the capital city is burning, my business is not safe. According to economists' estimates, Russia could face the risk of losing 10 to 20% of its industrial production if such attacks continue. If Ukraine carries out another 50 to 60 drone attacks in a month, critical infrastructure could be damaged beyond repair. This would accelerate the devaluation of the Russian ruble, reduce purchasing power, and fuel inflation. Even if the flames in Moscow are extinguished, the economic fire may not be easily contained. The Kremlin may attempt multiple strategies to preserve state power. Official media may continue to claim, only minor attacks, limited damage, everything is under control. They may attempt to further restrict social media. However, the public is witnessing explosion videos shared from mobile phones. It is not easy to conceal the truth. By launching intense missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, it could send the message, if you hit us, you will pay the price. However, this would further galvanize Ukraine and the West, strengthening allegations of war crimes against Russia. It could grant security forces full authority to crush anti-war activists, street protests, or minority movements. Ultimately, a regime of fear grows, but economic problems and continued attacks could erode this wall of fear. In the long run, the iron fist strategy could also fail. When the current situation becomes so dire that it threatens its own power, the Kremlin may take a step back and signal to intermediary countries that it is willing to sit down at the negotiating table with Ukraine. However, given the current political climate in Russia, this seems like a rather weak possibility at the moment. In other words, the Kremlin is torn between standing its ground and retreating. Domestic political balances will also play a role in this decision. If Putin's administration cannot change the perception that we cannot achieve a new victory and even Moscow is burning, it could be dragged into a crisis that would threaten his hold on power. Experts say that the greatest impact of the Moscow raids is that they have popularized war fatigue. Even those who supported the war at the beginning, saying that it was a special operation that would be short-lived, may now begin to think that this is a dead end. Families are suffering from the pain of losing their loved ones at the front. And when the capital is bombed on top of that, they ask, why are we continuing this war? Protests spilling into the streets can be curbed by Russia's harsh police measures. But this anger can manifest itself in other ways. Factory workers, civil servants, or law enforcement officers may carry out their duties reluctantly, disrupting the functioning of the state. People can criticize the government on social media using fake accounts or give interviews to foreign media. This would deal a blow to Russia's propaganda monopoly. There could be an exodus from centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg to rural areas or abroad. This could lead to the collapse of metropolitan culture, a contraction of the urban economy, and an acceleration of the brain drain of elites and skilled workers. When a drone attack alert is issued in the city, major airports such as Sheremetyevo and Domodedovo are temporarily closed to flights. Passengers see that their flights have been delayed or canceled. This disrupts both the economy and people's daily lives. When explosions occur, Moscow police immediately cordon off certain areas. Barricades and checkpoints are set up in the streets. City transportation slows down, and people wait in line for hours. Tension rises. Prices on store shelves continue to rise. Currency fluctuations cause import costs to skyrocket. Inflation, which was already high, is being further fueled by the attacks. People are beginning to avoid social events and crowded places. With fears that a drone might hit there, restaurants and shopping malls are emptying out. The entertainment sector is collapsing. Even staying at home is not peaceful because air defense missiles explode overhead in the middle of the night. On the other hand, nationalist groups may resort to more hawkish rhetoric, calling for tough measures and leveling Ukraine to the ground. This would increase the risk of internal conflict. Some Russian citizens may even make reckless calls for all-out war with NATO. The Kremlin, meanwhile, would struggle to formulate a clear strategy amid the chaos. With these attacks, Ukraine is reinforcing the image in the West that it has exceeded its defensive capabilities and is now demonstrating its offensive power on Russian territory, especially in European public opinion. The idea that if we provide more military aid, the war might end in Kiev's favor, given that Ukraine can penetrate deep into Russia's heartland, could take root. The US and NATO allies might decide to send additional air defense and unmanned systems, arguing that these attacks are wearing down the Russian army. The biggest advantage for Ukraine is forcing Russia to rebuild its air defense on its own territory. When systems such as S-300, Panzer, Tor, and Buk, which are used on the front lines, are withdrawn to protect Moscow, the front weakens. This increases the likelihood of the Ukrainian army advancing on the ground. At the same time, some of Russia's long-range missile stockpiles may be moved to internal regions for defensive purposes. What could happen next? Ukraine continues to strike Moscow and its surroundings with 2 to 3 large drone waves every week. Russia may repel some of them each time, but some will hit their targets. Fear in the city grows, economic damage multiplies. Protests or mass migration may erupt inside the country. The Kremlin will try to suppress them with harsh police measures, but in the long run, the regime's legitimacy will erode. Russia may turn to mediators such as Turkey or China to reach an agreement with Ukraine, arguing that even Moscow is not safe, and this path leads to disaster. However, both Russian nationalists and Ukraine's belief that they can gain more may make an agreement difficult. Still, this option should not be ruled out in an escalating crisis. Even if the parties do not sign a deep ceasefire and move toward full peace, a new, frozen conflict formula could emerge. Russia could promise to halt attacks on Ukraine to quell internal unrest. while Ukraine could suspend its plans to bomb Moscow. However, without a lasting agreement, the storm could erupt again. The Kremlin could launch a massive missile barrage, saying, "Since Moscow is burning, let's destroy all of Ukraine's infrastructure." This would cause massive destruction, but strengthen the resolve of the West and Ukraine. Ultimately, this would lead to a harsher escalation that diplomatically isolates Russia and wears it down on the battlefield. The common thread in every scenario is that Russia's ability to control the war is weakening. If even Moscow can be easily targeted, this war has long since crossed the boundaries of logic. In short, the flames in Moscow are not mere visual effects. They are the outward manifestation of Russia's crumbling economic and social structure. As the people ask, where is the great victory we were promised? The Kremlin has no answer. Petrochemicals, military production, logistics chains, all are being disrupted one by drone attacks. A large-scale raid involving 400 drones is enough to test Russia's resilience in just a few days. Data suggests that if these attacks continue, the Russian economy could shrink by an additional 15%. 20% of the population could flee the country, and internal protests could erupt within 5 to 6 months. Ukraine's goal is clear. If Russia prolongs the war in Ukraine, we will create a war zone in their heartland. The only question remaining is whether these attacks will accelerate fractures within Russia, forcing it toward peace negotiations, or whether the Kremlin will harden its stance and push the country down an even darker path. In either case, it is now undeniable that the flames in Moscow have the power to transform the Russian landscape. What are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments section. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and enable notifications. Thank you for watching.